In this episode, I reflect on the impacts of AI on work, the economy, and its future ramifications. Welcome to Monologues by Hassie. All the way back in 2023 was when I first started to become more aware of AI as we know it today in a professional setting. As a much younger software engineer, my more senior colleagues were starting to use tools like ChatGPT, which had just come out the year prior, right? Back at the end of 2022 is when the chatbot interface of ChatGPT was released and adoption started to pick up, but they were kind of using it not so much to do their work, but when they had problems, it was another source that they would consult amongst all the things that we were already consulting, be it programming documentation or something like Stack Overflow, where people had collectively put together solutions to deal with problems people were struggling with when trying to solve programming or technology-related issues. And it was something that was starting to be used to help do the work, but I wouldn't really say augment. It was more of a research tool that you might have used all the way back then. And I remember a funny story, again, in the professional software engineering work sense, where me as a younger developer had asked one of my senior colleagues for help with a problem. I mentioned a few things I'd tried, and they said, hey, why don't you go and try ChatGPT? Try asking it and see if it gives you anything helpful. And so I did. And I wrote a summary in a Slack thread. And I remember like 5 or 10 minutes later, my head of engineering sent me a private message and he said, hey, Hassie, I saw that you spoke about using ChatGPT. Look, you're working with a lot of senior engineers who have vast years of experience. I don't want them to think any less of you for using tools like that. And the irony was, fast forward to a few years later, I left that company and rejoined, and it was very much an AI-first workplace when I came back. And this is not a negative thing. In fact, my head of engineering at the time was very concerned for my reputation. And one thing I didn't do, which is funny, is rat out my senior colleagues. I didn't say, hey, it was actually, that senior engineer there who suggested I go do this. I let it slide, copped the feedback on the chin, and continued work. And so it's funny, even in a professional context, how the perceptions of using tools like ChatGPT in a professional sense have definitely changed from 2022, 2023, all the way to now in 2026. So it's completely changed the way we work. And we're in very interesting times right now where there have been talks, and I think one of the big selling points of AI is that it's going to revolutionize, I think, a lot of white-collar work. So if tasks are repeatable and they're done on a computer, then these are ripe for disruption, and I do agree with that. But there's a lot of talk about us being in this bubble. And we may be in a bubble, and I think that comes down to the way that a lot of the financing for AI is being done, whether the commitments that are proposed, like the number of data centers that are going to build, if there's funding for that. And then if these data centers do get built and we have more of these hyperscalers and the infrastructure to use AI on a scale at an even higher level than we're starting to use now, is there actually going to be enough revenue generated either directly from AI or from it automating existing business purposes or creating new business opportunities? Is there going to be enough money to sustain that infrastructure development? And on top of that, there's the issue of circular financing, where a lot of these, I think the biggest one is NVIDIA, which owns a stake in OpenAI. It's almost like a circle jerk, right? You have orders which haven't been fulfilled, and the share price of one entity rises, and therefore the share prices of another entity rises, and people are saying we're in a bubble, and we may very well be in a bubble. It definitely, we could very much be in bubble territory, but I think one important thing is, regardless of whether we're in a bubble or we're not in a bubble, is that AI is here to stay. And if we look all the way back to the late 90s, this could be very much like the dot-com bust, where yes, you have a massive correction in the valuations of AI companies and businesses dealing with AI and offshoots. But ultimately, just like in the dot-com bust, whilst a lot of companies may have gone out of business, it did not kill the internet. The internet kept growing, right? There was just a change in the valuations. Things became more realistic, and it's continued to develop as a technology. The same is for AI. It's not going to go away. So I think from that perspective, yes, we may be in a bubble, but to think that AI is going to disappear in 10 years because everything's going to come crashing down, I don't necessarily think that is the case. Now, back to the world of work. As a software engineer, I think, back in 2023, my senior colleagues were saying, hey, on top of all the ways you would typically solve a problem, be it, going to Stack Overflow, reading documentation, using Google, start also checking tools like ChatGPT, and the answers, the solutions weren't perfect back then. And I remember in 2024, I embarked on a year where I was developing my own products, and at the start of that year, I bought a GitHub Copilot subscription. And it was quite cheap back then. I don't think there was an expensive plan, but it was just something like $10 a month. And remember back then, I guess these AI tokens and credits, they were being heavily subsidized, so they could do that. But I remember in 2024 being incredibly frustrated with GitHub Copilot. I was using it in what we as software developers call IDEs, our integrated development environments. That's how we did things. And I've worked in data engineering and software engineering for a while, and your IDE, that's where you work. If you, you see those movies or TV shows and you see somebody typing into like colored text on a black screen, you're probably looking at an IDE. Maybe you're looking at a terminal. But basically, this is Microsoft Word for software developers, data engineers, the people who work in the software and allied space. And GitHub Copilot was a tool, it was an AI tool that kind of integrated into that platform at the time. And I remember finding it such a frustrating experience because it was, to be fair, back then I felt, and maybe because this is because I wasn't using it properly, but to a large part, it's also because of the capabilities of these models back then, I actually found that it was hindering me in work. And I remember I was doing a few things which were outside my comfort zone, dealing with front-end frameworks. I still found it incredibly frustrating to be using AI to do that. It was much easier for me to read the documentation and manually get things working together. Now, obviously that has changed in 2026, but back then, I think after maybe 2 to 4 months, I can't remember exactly long, of having this GitHub Copilot subscription, I canceled it and just went back to doing things manually, right? And researching things. And if I had a bug and I'm like, okay, great, this piece of this library doesn't work, I was searching those up the old way. And I'm grateful that I had to do that. And I'll come to that later. But basically in 2024, I got to a state where I was like, no, not going to use AI. Now, fast forward to 2026, I've just finished up a 1-year contract as a data engineer, and the use of AI was unparalleled. As I said, I came back to a company I left, and it was, quite interesting to see that it had transitioned to a AI first workplace. The head of engineering, who was concerned about me using, even just mentioning ChatGPT in a Slack thread, they would he made sure that I had access to all the AI tooling I needed. So I think environment around AI had shifted, but then over the past, I think, 12 to 14 months, I've seen the ability of code generation through these large language models. It's changed drastically. On top of that, I think there are a few paradigms out there about how we're using these in our work. So as a developer, I mentioned that GitHub Copilot was a tool that integrated into the environment that I was already used to working in. It's in my IDE. And I think this is the first paradigm. So GitHub Copilot, it gives you access to kind of pick and choose which LLMs, which models you want to use. So it's kind of like a fast food buffet, right? You can have Chinese food, Italian, you can have like Texas barbecue, like you pick and choose what you want. You can optimize models based on different use case, on costs, and you can play around with different LLMs to see which ones suit your purpose. So as a baseline framework, I think it was quite good because it let me, in a professional context, try out different models. And that was interesting because I think looking at the early capabilities of the models we were using, and I think for a significant portion of the last, again, 12 to 14 months, I was using models by Anthropic. So this is Claude, we're talking your sonnets, your opuses. These are the kind of families of LLMs that I'd been using in a commercial context. And they were really good. It changed the way the development flows worked. To a certain point, our ability to get through tickets and basically churn out code was at an unparalleled level. And now, personally, I'm again doing some independent development, and I'm using models like ChatGPT Sol 5.6, and they are absolutely fantastic. It's actually amazing. Having come off a decent amount of time sticking to Anthropic models, I must say I'm quite impressed by GPT 5.6. It's fast, and its code generation capabilities, both in terms of targeting the solution to the context and the inputs you provide, and the speed at which it does this is incredible. So the technology is it's already improved drastically, and I can see it getting better. So it isn't going away. I think AI is definitely here to stay, and it's changed the way we work. So coming to the next point is, okay, the way we work has changed. And I can say this as somebody who is in a field that has been heavily impacted by AI. I mean, software developers, and I'm not a developer of AI. I'm somebody who is, yes, a developer, but I'm a consumer of these products, right? The people developing AI are an abstraction layer very much removed from me. So as a consumer, I can see how the field has definitely changed. And then the next point is, how does this change the people who, there are the people who use the AI, but then there's the people who are buying this AI and what they think they're buying, and that is really the executive class. And it has been sold over and over again, and this is the big fears that you see kind of out there, especially amongst white-collar workers, the fear of AI replacing all their jobs. That has ultimately been the biggest selling point to get executives, to get the business executive class on board with implementing AI in their organizations. The whole selling point has been the reason that the executive class is frothing. It's because they've been promised incredible cost savings. And there's two mindsets to this. The first mindset is, if you have an executive class who is viewing, there's going to be a portion of them who view the use of AI as a reductionist factor on their balance sheets. They look at their labor costs, they say their labor costs are high, and AI is a means to drop that labor cost as low as possible. So that's a reductionist mindset. So that's saying we're going to produce whatever services we're producing, but we're going to significantly reduce our cost base. And I think that's one extreme. And then at the other extreme, you have, we're not going to reduce our cost base. We're going to keep hiring. We're going to keep bringing more humans on board. But AI just means that our throughput per person has increased. So both ends of the extreme see the increased throughput, or they believe that there's going to be an increased throughput. But one end says, okay, we can expand what we're able to do. We can capture more value in the market. We can provide more products, more services. What we're able to do is high. So amongst these two extremes, most companies will sit somewhere in that mix once they've decided to adopt. Ultimately, AI is a force multiplier. It multiplies what we're capable of doing. And I think the executive class and a large portion of the business class who may be implementing AI strategy and thinking about how AI will change their businesses have missed a very important point that they haven't been made aware of, because they're not the people physically using these tools. The person writing the pitch deck to implement AI at the organization is very different from the software developer who might have had half his team laid off, who is now using AI to augment his own workflows, or his or her own workflows. And the reason that this is such I think a big point that's been missed is AI is, the outputs of AI so far, it's a context-driven system. So I think the outputs that people have been seeing, let's rewind, from 2023, from when we had these kind of simple chatbot, which was great at kind of responding to you, and people were having, I'm talking about non-software engineering use cases where they were amazed by the capabilities of this chatbot, to now the integration of AI in fields such as software engineering, and it's coming into other white-collar fields as well, such as accounting and law, to name a few. But there is an output illusion that I believe has not been captured by the people who are sitting at the board level, and that is the outputs of AI is context driven. And I'm not making this point very clear yet. I'm going to get to this, but that is a very, very important point. I want you to hold on to that word, context. And context is super important when we're talking about the outputs of LLMs. So let me go back to a movie that some of you may have seen. If anyone's watched The Imitation Game, it's basically a movie where Alan Turing, the father of the Turing machine, the early computer, they basically built the computer to crack the German Enigma machine. It was an encryption machine that the Germans used to encrypt their radio signals. And basically, it was so Germans could send messages between their units. And because the Allies were unable to crack the code, the Germans had this advantage. They could send messages over radio, and no one knew what they were saying because there were these encrypted messages. Now, in the movie The Imitation Game, there is a scene where Alan Turing is speaking to one of his colleagues in a bar, and she mentions that she's somebody who receives the messages and types them out. And she says, "Oh, my radio counterpart in the German, communications department, he's my boyfriend because he always says the same sequence at the start of every message." And it's like a light bulb moment in that scene because they all realize that at the end of every German telecommunication, there are two words, Heil Hitler. That's how the Germans were ending these messages. And that is a very, very important point. Because in the movie, they're basically struggling to crack the Enigma code. They've built this computer. It can compute all these calculations. But the Enigma machine, they reset the codes, the settings on it every 24 hours. So they actually need to crack the codes faster. And for all this time, they haven't been able to do that. But once they've realized that there is a common phrase in every message that the Germans send, Heil Hitler, at the end, it is a case of reducing the problem space. Now they have these two words, and using those two words, they can just solve that problem. And from there, it becomes easier to solve the settings for the Enigma machine. So they crack the code. Now, in the actual version of that story, I think they were using other phrases. It wasn't quite as simple as Heil Hitler. The Germans had like a daily weather report, and the phrasing of that was typically quite consistent. So they were using longer phrases of messages to help speed up the cracking of the Enigma code for that day. But that's a very important point. The reason that Alan Turing and everyone who was working to crack the Enigma, once they had the computer set up, were able to do it within that 24-hour time frame is they had context. They knew a portion of the method. They were able to drive the output to a solution. And I think that's why there's actually this output illusion that it currently exists, and there are going to be some downterm problems from this. So why am I talking about an output illusion? So these large language models are basically, it's been described as a word salad. It is a guessing game. If I give an LLM 3 characters, A, B, C, and I only allow one character to be the output, then I am going to be given the letter D. Now, the LLM isn't actually aware that in English we have this alphabet of 26 characters and they are ordered A, B, C, D, E, and so on. All it knows is that based on the data it's been trained, if it sees A, B, C, the next character in the sequence is D. Now, when you were younger, you might have had to do tests that tested you on patterns. I remember when I was much younger doing tests like in Australia, we have like the selective school test or the opportunity class test. These are tests to get you into specific schools. They would ask you these puzzles, these kind of, they'd show you shapes or a number sequence, and you'd have to guess which one comes next. That is what an LLM does, and amazingly, it does that very well, and it's getting increasingly better as I just spoke about. But that's what it does. It is a guessing game. Now, on a broader scale, the reason, let's say a company that has a very reductionist perspective of AI, and they say, we currently have 20 engineers, we only want to have 1 engineer or 2 engineers, and they're going to use AI to do everything. They can do that, but the reason those 1 to 2 engineers can do that, are able to leverage AI to that point, is because they are the context that drives the outcomes. Now, when I said I was very grateful for having ditched AI in 2024 and done things the old way, The reason I'm grateful for that is it helped me, it was part of me building my craft over many years. The fact that I've been able to do things the old way and think about them and encounter the pitfalls and struggle means that now when I see an AI output, even if that code was generated at a volume that is unparalleled in terms of what I would have been able to output in the same time span, I can still look at the architecture, I can still critique things, I still understand what I'm seeing. And if I don't like what I'm seeing, if I don't like what the word salad, what the LLM has output, I can reprompt it to push that solution into the outcome that I actually want to achieve. So if we look at the company that went from 20 engineers to 2 engineers, those engineers have an understanding of the business domain and the technology, and they're able to evaluate and fine-tune these outputs of the LLMs. And that's why I think AI being a force multiplier, and that's an important word, the word multiplier, you have to have something to multiply. You have to have knowledge and context to multiply. That is where the value of AI is. So I think this is a very important concept to grasp, and I actually think it's something that's lost. The reason people feel productive now is because we've had to do things the old way, and you have professionals who have been given this new abstraction layer of AI, and whether consciously or subconsciously, the reason they're able to do amazing things is they've had to do things the old way. And they're now leveraging. They have gone from being an individual contributor to fundamentally being a value multiplier. They are now a manager of the LLM, and they might be the manager of many agents doing different tasks. And it's the fact that there's a human in the loop, in the process, that is crafting these systems, that is evaluating the outputs of these systems and taking accountability for the systems, that we're able to have this leverage multiplication effect. Now, this doesn't change the fact that that also means that, yeah, maybe a company decided to get rid of 18 engineers and keep 2, and that does create a lot of issues. But what I want to highlight is that decision-making and context has never been more important than ever. And I still see this in so many businesses and companies, is that I think the core fundamentals have been forgotten. When I left university and first started my career, I was part of an automation team using a technology called robotic process automation. And I think one of the most important lessons I learned there, I still carry with me to this day. And it's the 3-step hierarchy of when you think you want to automate something, decide whether it can be eliminated, whether that process can be optimized, and only then should you automate it. So eliminate, optimize, automate. And I think the big problem with having a multiplier, a force multiplier like AI, is that it is so easy to create these outputs that people are forgetting to actually analyze whether something is actually worth doing. Should you eliminate it? Do you have a stupid process in your business that you're now trying to palm off to an agent, to an LLM? That's one. And second, before you palm it off to an agent, can you optimize that process and then automate it? And that's an important word, automate it. Automation and passing something off to an LLM there is a distinction. And I want to make that distinction in the sense that, like I said, LLMs, it's a word salad, it's a guessing game. It's a non-deterministic system. Yes, if I give it like that example where I said ABC and I only allow for one character, it's D, but in terms of the business value of these systems, we're not limiting our output to one character where we can easily check this. We have these large context windows for inputs, and then we have large amounts of output. That's really where people want to derive the value. And so because it's so easy to generate code, generate documents, whatever you're trying to do, right? It's easy to increase your volume of output. No one is actually stopping to determine whether what they're trying to automate is actually, worth automating. And then in terms of automation, you can actually automate something the traditional way, which is building a deterministic system. You could build code which does that automation, which doesn't rely on making calls to either third-party providers like OpenAI or Anthropic to use their models like the GPTs or, Claude, Opus, Sonnet. You don't need to necessarily be making calls to these external third-party providers of these models. And there's also the option to actually just build code that does that automation, right? So I think it should be eliminate, optimize, automate, and then automate using AI. Like there should be that fourth step, is that before you try to automate something with AI and LLM, determine whether it's simple enough that you can build a very easy deterministic system. And of course, these things require maintenance. Like everything requires maintenance, right? Be it your business processes or your code. Everything rots. And it needs people who care to maintain that, care or are incentivized to maintain that. So I think even when it comes to deciding whether to automate, there is a very important distinction of automating by sending something to an LLM to get a response, or building a deterministic system. And you know what? You might actually use an LLM to build code, which now, you can have an engineer test. They can build test cases and they can be more certain of the outputs. So I think decision-making is important, and I think it is being lost on a lot of businesses. And this is why, even though there are a lot of businesses using AI and feeling productive, whether that AI is being used to actually generate money, whether it's being used to generate value to their shareholders, it's a whole other thing. So the short-term value, I think that a lot of CEOs, CFOs, and the executive class have been sold on is that you can reduce your workforce. And some of them have absolutely done that, and they've been able to get away with that because they still have people in the business who have the context, who understand the technology, who understand the business use cases, who are willing to speak to clients and understand their issues. And they can now leverage this. So it is a context-driven system. AI is a force multiplier. It by itself will not add value, right? It has to be driven towards these outputs which provide value. So I think in the business sense, there is currently, because AI is so recent, there is a massive output illusion because the people currently leveraging AI are the people who did not have access to AI before. So there is a 100%, in my opinion, an output illusion that it is going to start to fade in time. And here's why I think it's going to fade. So from a professional context, one thing that I've personally noticed over the past 12 months working that contract is because we're trying to do so much more with less in a professional context, deep work has almost been exterminated. It has been vastly, vastly, vastly harder to work deeply because a big focus is you're leveraging these tools to deliver more value with less resources. And yes, you can ship things off to code, but remember, these are context-driven systems. So the poorer the inputs, the poorer the outputs. It really is a case of garbage in, garbage out, which is the case for data engineering, software engineering. That is a very, very old principle. If you put garbage in, you will get garbage out. So deep work has been eliminated, and I think this causes a few issues. So one is we're generating more code at a much higher basis. And then the technical debt has always been an issue. So now we're generating technical debt at a higher basis. Now, of course, you have these AI systems, which hypothetically you can use to do refactors and things like this. And I actually did create a group of skills and set up sub-agents to work on a bunch of refactors of our data pipelines. And it was incredible, right? This is work that would have taken 1.5 to 2 months. But by doing a few use cases and building some deterministic hooks into our code base, I was able to reduce that time frame, right? Now you could do this work in the span of a couple of hours. And so that's incredible. But the amount of thought that went into that is quite significant, right? Building these guardrails and making sure the outputs are well curated. And so really, it is important when building these AI systems that you think about the processes that you're trying to automate and what you're trying to do. So technical debt is an issue. And one thing I've noticed is that in software engineering, peer review has always been a very important part of the work. You're not just writing code, you're reading code generated by others and you're assessing it and you're providing feedback. Now, if you're in a repo where you need, let's say, one approval before that code can get pushed into the code base where it can become part of production, then if you have a case where you have somebody who's very happy with AI output and they're ticking everything, then all of a sudden your AI generated code in your company is just going through. So one thing that I noticed is a lot of architectural patterns and conventions are now are just starting to fall apart because these AI systems are generating code, and if there really isn't human control of the code base, if everything's just getting pushed in, you're going to lose a lot of standards. So technical debt is just on crack. So I think that is a problem that is a lot of companies are going to have to deal with eventually. Right? Some probably are already dealing with it. I've heard a lot of use cases of, I think one of the amazing things of AI is that it has democratized software engineering. So people have been able to get, using tools like Lovable, for example, they've been able to get their business ideas up. But one thing I hear is that once they do something on Lovable, a lot of these successful startups are still going back to software developers to productionize their systems. And so that part of the equation is still there. Because you can, I think from a non-technical context, you can get started, but then you might want somebody who understands what's happening behind the scene to take you from 1 to 50 in terms of your technical solution and your architecture. So technical debt is increasing. And then I think something more worrying, and this kind of comes back to the output illusion that I was talking about earlier, is that we're actually engineering a context problem. And I think this is such a large issue, and not enough people are thinking about this and figuring out ways to mitigate this. And like I said, AI isn't going to go away, but I think a lot of context is going to disappear. So I said I'm very grateful for having gone through university before AI came out. Now, ChatGPT, like I said earlier, came out in 2022, but these AI was in development well before then. And it just became commercially or aware to the broader public starting at the end of 2022, 2023. And right now we're generating this context problem in the sense that there is so much cognitive offloading happening, and there is so much elimination of deep work and thought that imagine if everyone has now offloaded their work and they've stopped thinking and they've stopped reviewing the outputs of AI, be it code or documents or PowerPoints. They've simply outsourced all of this knowledge to all of this work to these large language models. You now have a problem where people have stopped being able to think. And the issue with AI being deterministic is it doesn't come up with new solutions. It simply converges. You can let an agent and a system run by itself, but the more you let it run by itself without auditing the outputs and setting it back on the right track, is that it's going to produce something weird. You'll hear the general term AI slop, and that describes a broad range of things. Everything from AI-generated code, to documents, to reports, to AI slop videos and music, right? This is where the human, I think, is even more important in the age of AI, is that we are the drivers of context. Nassim Taleb had this statement, and I remember reading this again very early on, almost around the time when I kind of temporarily stopped using AI back in 2024. It was because AI is built on historical information. It is trained on knowledge that humans have already created. It is not only non-deterministic, right? So it's not only non-deterministic, it's not only guessing, but when it does guess, it can only guess based on what it has had access to in the past. And this means that you always converge, right? When we look at the creation of true human knowledge, it's actually divergence. It's thinking outside the box. It's thinking, how do we get to the next frontier? And so from a person, and this was one of my personal worries, is that if I continued working in the way where to kind of stay alive, to exist in this new corporate world where you have been embedded with this fear of losing your job, which I personally don't have, but when people are embedded with this fear of losing their job, that they use these systems in such a way to produce output to justify their value in the organization, and they've offloaded so much of their own thinking. We're going to have a context problem where people stop being able to do the things they used to be able to do. Now, hypothetically, if you build systems to do this, you can build systems to do this, but you're still going to need people to come and fine-tune these systems. So I think that's going to become more rare. That's one of the problems I see. And the second part of the kind of context problem that we're engineering is the fact that we're not training enough young people, that the early career pathways have disappeared. So in an ironic way, I'm very lucky to have got into software engineering when I did, because I was able to get a few years of doing things the old way. And that helped me build the craft as a technician and really understand both the technical problems and how to interface with businesses and business units and understand their problems and translate that into something that's useful. A lot of young people aren't being given these opportunities because, like in that extreme reductionist example I gave, where a company goes from 20 engineers down to 2, they're not hiring the young engineer now. They want to bring in somebody mid-level, somebody senior who can now drive these systems, drive the AI, produce the outputs at a faster rate. So less people are willing to invest in younger talent. And I think there is going to be an experiment that's played out in that realm. And like I said, the output illusion that a lot of the CEO, the CFO, the executive class has is because they don't grasp the importance of the context that is being used to currently craft any increases in productivity they're seeing. AI is a force multiplier. And so there is no incentive to hire young people, but when they are hiring young people, there is an experiment that is being played out right now, and I don't know the results of this. And that experiment is, how cheap of a person can we get to provide context to these systems? So you can have somebody who was previously like a $300,000 a year engineer driving these systems, but now there is an experiment being played where can we have somebody who's come fresh out of high school, fresh out of university, drive the context for these systems? And sometimes, and depending on the context, and again, this depends on the area of the business you're operating. The experiment of trying to figure out how cheap, how little you can pay people to work on these AI systems is an experiment that is currently being played out. In some businesses, the case is, you no longer need the expensive workers. So you can almost eliminate them. We can get away with somebody much cheaper. We don't need to pay them as much. They don't have as much formal training, but based on our use cases, no issues. And then there are going to be some businesses where that experiment is very different, where they're going to try and use less skilled workers to provide the context for these systems, and it's not going to go right. Maybe they're going to have regulatory issues. Maybe their clients are going to demand a higher standard of work. Maybe there are going to be problems that go missed, that go uncovered. So this is an experiment which I think is natural. It is going to have to be played. I'm not making a moralistic stance on it. It will happen because the whole purpose of the experiment is to see how low can we go in terms of paying the working class to drive context for these LLM systems. And it's a sliding scale, right? For certain industries, it's going to be lower. And for other industries, it's going to be, you know what? We actually still need those senior people to drive context. Like, there is value to their problem solving. We need them, and they're going to use the leverage. So I think that experiment is currently being played out. But the broad problem is that early career market, the market where people got to develop their skills, do the dumb things, make the mistakes, that just, the incentive isn't there right now. And a big part of that is, I think, the whole marketing spiel that the business executive class have been sold by these large AI providers, by OpenAI, by Anthropic, that their labor costs are going to come down, that there's white collar jobs are going to be decimated. And look, I'm not denying that the white collar world is going to change. It will 100% change. But that value chain, the leverage that certain employees may have had in certain sectors, it has 100% changed. And so I think we are engineering future problems from two perspectives. One, we're not training enough young people in the technical systems, in the business systems, understanding the actual context of industries to then be able to go and leverage AI in the future. So we're creating this pipeline problem that we're going to, if an industry notices that when it's trying to optimize its kind of labor equation, its seniority equation, if it realizes that it does need senior people, those industries are going to have a big problem with getting people down the track to maintain these systems. And secondly, I think at a more individual level, to the people already in the workforce, the cognitive offloading that is happening, especially if you're in an environment where you're not using AI mindfully, where AI is just something you're given so you can justify keeping your job, there is going to be an issue of cognitive offloading, and I think people feeling burnt out and actually losing a lot of their skills, which made them valuable in the first place. So there's a context problem that I think is twofold. First, it's a training pipeline, and second, it's the fact that there's going to be a lot less care applied to the governance and auditing of the outputs of these systems, right? As more and more cognitive offloading happens, people are going to stop thinking critically about the outputs of the AI, simply because Just like a manager with too many reports, they might have too many agents or too many tasks to complete by using agents or LLMs. And so the visibility, I think the auditing of the outputs is going to significantly decrease. And that's why I think, like thinking about deterministic systems, back to the eliminate, optimize, automate, like going back to that is so important for businesses. And I think it's just been lost. But I think that's standard. It's not something people think about anyway. I think that the current cost of AI is deferred, and there's the tech debt perspective, there is the context perspective, also the fact that tokens are heavily subsidized right now. So the other thing is we've switched from prompt-based billing, so like billing for the number of requests you're making to the agent. And this year in July, a lot of providers switched. So this new financial year, a lot of these providers have switched from prompt-based billing, where you got, I think, a lot more value for money, where power users could essentially get a lot more usage of these systems than what they were paying for, to token-based billing, right? So now you're paying for how many tokens of input and output you're producing as you engage with these LLMs. And so the cost for the LLMs has already increased. So I think the business case that a lot of the executive class was relying on, where you have these cheap AI tokens replacing your labor, that's going to change as well, because we're going to see the real cost of the tokens come up, and then you're going to see the context costs. And that is going to be a dangerous combination, I think. And it is a dangerous combination, but I'm excited about that, because at a personal level, when people make bad decisions, these are problems for other people to come and clean up. So I think that is almost value being generated in a very kind of sad way. So there is opportunity in that, right? If people cause problems, if they make messes, there is going to be a very expensive bill when it comes to cleaning these things up. And that bill has been deferred because a lot of costs have not been factored in. The rising costs of the tokens, we're still subsidizing tokens, even though we've switched to token-based billing from requests, it's still heavily subsidized. And so that's a big thing. So even if you're going to have systems that can do more, it's going to cost more. So that is really important. And then, I think there is going to be tremendous opportunity when the real costs of the changes we're experiencing, especially in the white collar world, it's felt that there's going to be a whole heap of opportunity for people to come in and fix it. I don't know what that's going to look like, but I personally am excited about this. If people are making mistakes, I want to make money from their mistakes, right? If businesses are if businesses are being short-sighted, then that is a massive opportunity. And I think this is where there is very untapped leverage. These are opportunities that don't currently exist yet, that are going to exist very, very soon. So next thing I want to think about is like where leverage actually lies. So like the value chain has shifted, right? So like I said, there are so many professions that have been affected. I think there have been so many tech layoffs recently, and a lot of companies say that we're cutting staff due to AI. It's not so true. There have simply been a lot of bad businesses from prior to during the kind of COVID downturn, and prior to that, there was a lot of money being funneled into businesses that simply weren't profitable. And I think now it is very convenient to say, hey, we have AI now, so we have to fire half our workforce, than to say, hey, we actually subscribed to way too much investment. We overhired. Our business model didn't pan out, and now we need to cut staff, right? It's much more sexier to say, hey, this is AI. And so the value chain is shifting. And the thing is that for a lot of smaller businesses who have access to, let's say, tools like Lovable for their basic systems, they can actually go create this. Yes, it might not be perfect. Yes, there might be 101 issues with the way they're doing things. They might be far from perfect, but having access to being able to create your own to-do list and maybe create a simple integration to your purchasing or order system is something that's of value to small businesses, right? They don't need to go and get a Jira subscription and pay this enterprise licensing fee. They can go and create their own project tracking. So you think of a lot of these larger businesses where, and I still think there is a value to SaaS. There are industries where you need regulations, you need accountability. They're basically paying for security. They're paying for, if something goes wrong, we need somebody to sue, right? That value is not going to go away. So SaaS isn't going to go away. But I think a part of that pie is being cut into because smaller entities can now take on a lot of that work that required big companies, big investment, large teams of engineers. They can now do that in-house. So that is a shifting of the value chain. Obviously, for employees, the value chain has shifted. There have been certain professions which I think, unfortunately, have definitely taken a brunt. I've been reading a lot about, I think, linguists and translators and interpreters, and for them, a lot of work has either simply dried up or people are no longer willing to pay the rates that they were paying. And that is very unfortunate. Like, you can have these systems which translate documents, but they might miss nuances. You might be auto-transcribing a TV show or an ad into different languages, and cultural context might be missed, but you get a good enough translation. And I think this is an example of where the people who are paying for the services of translators and interpreters, in certain cases, they don't actually want 100% good outcome. If they can get an 70 or 80% outcome at 20% of the cost, that's good enough for them. And I think that is very unfortunate, that shifting of the value chain, that is going to happen. And then in software engineering, I think you're seeing that you're being pushed this narrative, but then you see, I think it was Ford who rehired engineers after firing a large team of them, right? So there are cases where in certain aspects of business and certain professions, software engineers, for example, are being rehired. And that's a case where companies have tried out this experiment and they're kind of reneging on that whole, hey, we're going to reduce our workforce. And they're going, maybe AI is here to stay, but we actually need the people to drive the context, to maintain the solutions. And one thing everyone forgets is, just like code, all of these AI systems inherently rot. And they need maintenance, and they need to be updated to changing business conditions, market conditions, right? So and it was Ford. I'm just Googling this right now. So Ford brought back 350 veteran engineers and technical specialists, right? After they tried to go to artificial intelligence and automated quality control systems. So this is a perfect example of companies already kind of shifting back. So it really depends on the industry. And if you think about something like car manufacturing, and you compare that to something like translating, it's very different, right? If you have a production fault in a car and it causes accidents, that's a massive liability versus missing slight cultural context on that ad you were trying to translate from Bahasa Malaysia to Bahasa Indonesia, right? There might have been a little bit of mismatch, but for the most part, if you can get the message across, people are happy. And so it really depends on the industry and the jobs. But I think the important thing is, even though certain industries will rehire and reevaluate how much AI they're going to utilize, the work changes. The AI systems are still going to be there. And so ultimately, LLMs, large language models, they're shovels and tools. Like, a shovel and a tool still needs somebody. You still need somebody at the end of a shovel, right? That is a very, very important part. And tools don't make the craftsman. Tools do not make the craftsman. And ultimately, if I look at software engineering, I think the importance of actually having somebody there is that it's the person who commits the code who ultimately bears the responsibility for that system. And you can eliminate that and have agents doing all the work and generating the code and viewing it, and you can cut people out altogether. But when that happens, who bears responsibility? Who is accountable, right? Two different things, right? Responsibility and accountability. But who is responsible and accountable for these systems when something goes wrong? And I think that's where there is a case for humans in certain industries. Now, in everything that I've been speaking about now and these kind of ramblings on AI, there is a huge thing that we haven't been talking about, is that, there are going to be displaced workers. Like I was talking about with translators and interpreters. A lot of them, and I think translators more so than interpreters. Interpreters might be translating live speech, and that's a very different ballgame. But with the translators, I think a large amount of work has dried up because it's being passed to AI systems now. Somebody who had to previously hire like a 40, 50 euro an hour translator to translate a document from English to French might now pass that document into ChatGPT, right? They'll talk to their chatbot and they'll get that output out rather than pay that person. So I think that is, how do you deal with that situation? I think just like every other revolution we've had, if you look at the Industrial Revolution, you probably had increase in farming output through things like tractors and things that you were producing, and there's less need for farm workers, and you're getting more output per farmer. And then you have people who no longer are farmers, right? You used to have a previously very large agrarian society, even up until recently, a couple of 100 years ago. But now you have these new jobs, you have these factories, right, that are creating these tools and these products and utilizing the increased outputs of those farms. So what does the new world look like? And I think AI is kind of heading into a dangerous space. Maybe I want to say dangerous space, but I think that's going to kind of there is a big kind of talk about reaching AGI, artificial general intelligence. I'm personally not so convinced. Even when they've released these, models like Fable, and they say, "Hey, we're going to do this limited release to these few companies in the Department of Defense because we think it's going to change the world." I think this is still a big marketing gimmick. I think the idea that these systems are thinking, that they're actually thinking, right? Life forms are thinking versus being these non-deterministic guessing games is. I don't think, I think there's going to be a big shift backwards actually from that messaging as people realize that the realities of the development of these systems is very different. Like I said at the start of this episode, it is amazing. I am personally amazed by how far large language models have come. I utilize them in my workflow. A big part of the reason I'm doing some independent work now is I'm recalibrating the way I work and think about problems so I can use these systems more consciously and I can still leverage my human value. But for a large part of the workforce, I think it is gonna change how things work. And unfortunately, there are going to be executives who work on a 3 to 6 to 1 year time frame, on short time frames, because that's when they get their bonus structures and their KPIs evaluated, who aren't really going to care about the long-term impacts, even for the company, right? The company might do worse for their decisions made in the span of 1 year, but if they're able to reduce their workforce by 30% by implementing AI, and they get to collect a big benefit, they don't really care if the company suffers down the track, right? And there's an individual view of AI, and then I think we're going to get to a tragedy of the commons. So like tragedy of the commons is when, if one person decides not to dispose of their toxic waste properly and they dump it into the river, maybe you can get away with it, right? Everyone still uses the water in the river, but if one company does it, maybe it's okay. But then if everybody says, "Hey, that guy's throwing his trash into the water," and they all start doing it, great, you get a polluted water, and so everyone suffers. So this is the tragedy of the commons. I think we're going to get tragedy of the commons with AI. And one thing a lot of companies don't realize is that, yes, they can reduce their own labor costs, but a big part of our economy works is it's consumption and demand driven. Eventually, we're going to create a demand problem if you lay off so many workers. And this is something that I think at an individual, at a company level, a lot of founders and CEOs and executives say, "Hey, if we're able to reduce our cost basis and our workforce and pay absolutely no one and maximize output, this is amazing." But at an economy-wide level, if this happens, it's actually disastrous for these very companies. Let's take an example of the industry I just recently finished a contract in. I was working in a regulatory tech industry, that regulated employment law, that audited employee pay and benefits. Now, as an individual firm, being able to reduce our workforce and reduce our costs is incredible because we're able to reduce the cost of delivery of our services to companies who pay their employees. We're able to help them pay their employees properly and abide with the law. But imagine if these companies that are paying their employees are now able to reduce their headcounts. If they're able to reduce their workers, and in some cases, if you take an extreme, if they're able to eliminate their workforces, all of a sudden, the industry I was in that might have priced their contracts as a fee per employee that they're calculating benefits for, if the clients you're working for no longer have employees either. Your business just fucking disappeared. And a lot of people aren't seeing this. This is the tragedy of the commons scenario, where at an individual level, it might be cheap to throw your waste into the water, but once everybody starts doing it, everybody suffers. So this is, I think, a more systemic issue that we're going to see. Are we going to have to think about like safety nets for displaced workers? Are we going to have to refactor the way our societies work? I think these are big questions that society as a whole needs to ask. It is something that I think we're definitely going to have to deal with as industries change, as professions, especially white-collar professions, face increasing automation. It's something that we really need to think about at a societal level. And then I think the second thing that no one's costed is there are all these projections for how much AI we're going to use, but AI doesn't come for free. It might feel like that when we're on our laptops talking to ChatGPT or Claude, but these systems are not infinite, right? They are finite, and they are driven by physical resources. And that's the reason that the pricing structures have already started to change from response-based to token-based, and I'm almost certain that the price of those tokens will continue to increase. Is that how are we going to support the physical infrastructure in our world to support a high penetration of large language models being used in the business world? Like, how are we going to support data centers and hyperscalers? Like, they require water, they require electricity, they require physical space. And so thinking about those physical constraints for the growth of these models is something we do need to think about. How much energy, how much water are we going to need to drive these systems? So there's a few thoughts that I personally have that I think we're going to need answers to. I don't think we can leave it. These questions can't necessarily go unanswered. And so I've been rambling for quite a while now. This has been a very long talk. It's just some of these thoughts that I've had around AI, from first really being exposed to it a couple of years ago to having heavily used it in my last employment contract, and now kind of coming back to try and more mindfully work on problems and utilize AI. Because I'm not, the whole point of this podcast isn't to say, let's swear off AI, we're never going to use it, but it's to really weigh up the way we're using things and how these systems interact, and how it is ultimately going to change our world. I have no doubt about that, but I think a lot of the kind of projections and hype, I think things will go very differently. And I also think, like I said, that a lot of the messes that are going to be created, that are already being created and that are going to be created, there is going to be a lot of opportunity for people who are willing to roll up their sleeves and clean it up. And I think when it does come time to do that, it is absolutely fair to be demanding higher prices. And this is at the individual level, right? It's not just token pricing that I think is going to go up. I think some of these opportunities are going to be very lucrative to go and clean things up in this world where AI has been used and in certain cases misused. And so this is me rambling. I think I've been rambling for a very long time about LLMs and AI and how I think it's going to affect workers and individuals and the economy, but have some thoughts about how it's changed your own workflows. Because for me, I didn't realize it was so unconscious about how these tools had become such a big part of my workflow that I hadn't really stopped to think about it. So my prompt for those of you listening to it is to actually think about how has your own profession changed? I've spoken a lot about myself as a software engineer, but you might be doing something else. And how is artificial intelligence affecting your line of work? And what are things that you can do? What are opportunities? What are risks? What are things that you have to mitigate on a personal level to make sure you come outside the other end? And so I'm going to leave this episode here. To all of those who are listening to this, as always, I wish you great success on all your endeavors. You've just made it through another episode of Monologues by Hassie. It brings me great pleasure to know that you made it to the end. To listen to more episodes, subscribe on your favorite podcast app or visit monologuesbyhassie.com. Thanks for swinging by.